the chalk smeared red across the white Ferrari's hood. Blood red, not chalk at all. Silas Ravencroft stood frozen on the marble steps of his penthouse, watching a small figure collapse against his $4.3 million car. The boy couldn't have been more than 9. His thin frame crumpled like paper, one hand still gripping something, a piece of charcoal maybe, or a broken crayon. But what made Silas's breath catch wasn't the boy. It was what he'd drawn. Silas was 52 years old and owned half the luxury hotels in 3 continents. He'd built an empire from nothing, clawed his way up from a childhood he never spoke about, and learned early that sentiment was a weakness wealthy men couldn't afford. His Ferrari SF90 XX Stradale sat in the private underground lot of his Fifth Avenue building, surrounded by security cameras, motion sensors. It'd done a team of guards who knew their jobs depended on perfection. Yet somehow this child had gotten through. The boy's clothes were filthy, layers of donated shirts and a jacket 3 sizes too large. His sneakers had holes, but his hands, those small, trembling hands, had created something on the pristine white surface of Silas's most prized possession that made the billionaire's skin crawl. The drawing showed a woman's face twisted in terror, her mouth open, eyes wide, and beneath it, scratched in desperate strokes, "Help her! Building 7 tonight!" Silas pulled out his phone to call security. His thumb hovered over the screen. That's when he noticed the boy wasn't moving anymore. Silas Ravencroft didn't believe in mercy. He believed in results. 27 years ago, he'd walked away from his younger sister when she begged him for money to escape an abusive relationship. He'd told her to figure it out herself, the way he had. 3 months later, she was dead. He'd learned to live with that. He'd had to. His company, Ravencroft Global Holdings, owned 83 luxury properties worldwide and employed over 40,000 people. Forbes estimated his net worth at $8.9 billion. He attended charity galas where he wrote checks that made people weep with gratitude, then forgot about them before his driver reached the next stoplight. Trust was a currency Silas couldn't afford. He'd been betrayed by business partners, stolen from by his own CFO, and deceived by 2 ex-wives who saw him as a settlement waiting to happen. Every smile was a negotiation. Every kindness had an invoice. His penthouse occupied the entire 47th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park. A private elevator required 3 separate codes and a fingerprint scan. He lived alone except for a rotating staff of housekeepers who knew not to speak unless spoken to. The only thing Silas loved, truly loved, was his car collection. 7 vehicles worth a combined $31 million. The Ferrari was his favorite, custom-built with specifications he'd personally overseen in Maranello. It had been delivered 4 months ago. He'd driven it exactly twice, and now some street rat had vandalized it. Silas walked down the steps slowly, phone still in hand. The boy lay motionless, his cheek pressed against the car's door. Up close, Silas could see how young he really was. A baby, practically. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath dirty skin. His breathing was shallow. The drawing covered nearly the entire hood. It wasn't crude. That's what disturbed Silas most. It was skillful, detailed. The woman's terror felt real, as if she were looking directly at him, begging. "Building 7, Silas read aloud. His building had 9 residential structures across the city. Building 7 was in Brooklyn, a converted warehouse he'd purchased and renovated into 40 luxury apartments. This made no sense. This was a prank. It had to be. But the boy's hand was bleeding. The charcoal wasn't charcoal at all. It was a piece of sharpened stone or metal that had cut deep into his palm. He'd drawn this picture with his own blood, mixed with whatever pigment he'd found. Silas's finger moved toward the security number on his phone. The boy's eyes opened. "I'm the boy who saw everything." "Please," the child whispered. "She doesn't have much time." His voice was barely audible, but his eyes, dark brown, too old for his face, locked on to Silas with an intensity that made the billionaire take a step back. "Who are you?" Silas demanded. "Tobias." The boy tried to sit up and failed. I lived in the alley behind your building. For 3 weeks, I saw them." "Saw who?" "The men. They bring women in the service entrance, late at night. I watch from the dumpster area." Tobias coughed, and Silas saw blood on his lips. "This one. Tonight. She's different. She was fighting, screaming. They hit her. I tried to follow, but the guard chased me. I ran here because I knew this was your car. Everyone knows. You own everything." Silas's jaw tightened. You're telling me there are men trafficking women through my building, and you decided to commit vandalism as a way to inform me?" "I tried the front desk yesterday. They threw me out. I tried to stop a tenant. She crossed the street." Tobias's breathing grew more labored. I don't have a phone. I don't have anything. I can draw. I'm good at faces. I remember them. I thought if I showed you, if I made you see her." The boy's hand reached into his jacket and Silas instinctively stepped back. But Tobias only pulled out a crumpled piece of cardboard. On it were more drawings, dozens of faces, men and women, detailed sketches with notes scribbled around them in childish handwriting. "I've been documenting," Tobias said. 3 weeks, license plates, times, faces. I thought if someone official saw, they'd believe me. Wife, but no one listens to kids like me. We're invisible." Silas took the cardboard. His hands, which had signed billion-dollar deals without trembling, shook slightly. The drawings were extraordinary, photographic in their precision. Dates and times marked each one. A man with a scar above his left eyebrow. 2:47 a.m. black van. A woman with short hair. 3:15 a.m. screaming, mouth covered. And at the center, the woman from the Ferrari's hood. "Tonight, Building 7, Apartment 4, C or 4D. She saw me. She mouthed, 'Help.'" "Why didn't you call the police?" Silas asked, though even as he said it, he knew the answer. Tobias laughed bitterly, and it turned into another cough. "Cops don't help kids like me. They move us along, tell us we're making up stories for attention, and even if they believed me, by the time they investigate, she'll be gone." They always move them fast." Silas looked at his phone, looked at the boy, looked at the ruined car. Every instinct told him to call his lawyers, his security team, let them handle this mess while he went back inside to his temperature-controlled sanctuary. This wasn't his problem. He'd built his fortune by knowing which battles to fight and which to delegate. But something in those drawings made his chest tight. The woman's face, the terror. It looked like his sister. "Can you walk?" Silas heard himself ask. Tobias blinked in surprise. I think so." "Then get in the car." "What?" Silas was already unlocking the Ferrari. "You said Building 7, Apartment 4C or 4D? If you're lying to me, or if this is some elaborate con, I will personally ensure you're prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." But if you're telling the truth—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't know how to. Tobias climbed into the passenger seat, leaving bloody fingerprints on the leather. Silas didn't comment. He started the engine, a sound like controlled thunder, and pulled out of the garage. The drive to Brooklyn took 17 minutes. Silas drove in silence, his mind racing through scenarios. This was insane. He was trusting a homeless child based on a vandalized car and some sketches. He should turn around. He should call his head of security, Vincent, who handled these situations. But Vincent would ask questions. Vincent would want to investigate properly through proper channels. And if Tobias was right, there wasn't time for proper channels. "How did you learn to draw like that?" Silas asked, surprising himself. Tobias kept his eyes on the window. "My mom, she was an artist, did portraits in the park before—" He stopped. "Before what?" "Before she got sick. Cancer. We lost our apartment when she couldn't work. I was 7. We lived in shelters for a while. Then she died. I've been on my own for 2 years." 2 years? This child had survived alone on the streets for 2 years? "Why this woman?" Silas asked. "Why risk everything for a stranger?" Tobias finally looked at him. "Because everyone ignored my mom too. When she was dying, people stepped over her on the sidewalk. No one helped. I promised myself if I ever could help someone else, I would. Even if nobody helped me." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. They pulled up outside Building 7 at 9:47 p.m. The converted warehouse gleamed with expensive renovations, exposed brick, ordered industrial windows, doorman in the lobby. Silas had overseen every detail of the development. It was one of his proudest achievements. "Service entrance," Tobias said, pointing to an alley. They walked around the building. The service door was locked, but Silas had master access. His hands shook as he used his keycard. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered over concrete walls. It smelled like garbage and something else, something chemical that made Silas's stomach turn. "4th floor," Tobias whispered. They took the service stairs. With each step, Silas felt his heart hammering harder. This was real. This was happening, in his building, under his name. The 4th floor hallway was empty. Apartment 4C had a welcome mat that said, "Home Sweet Home." 4D's door was slightly ajar. Silas approached it, pressed his ear against the gap. He heard nothing at first. Then a muffled sound, a whimper. He pushed the door open. What no one noticed. The apartment was empty except for a mattress in the corner and a chair in the center of the room. A woman was tied to that chair. She was maybe 25, with dark hair matted to her skull and duct tape across her mouth. When she saw them, her eyes went wide, first with terror, then with desperate hope. It was the face from Tobias's drawing, exact in every detail. Silas froze. In that moment, every calculation he'd made about risk and liability vanished. He saw his sister. He saw every person he'd walked past, every plea for help he'd ignored because it wasn't convenient, wasn't smart business. He saw the man he'd become. "Call 911, he told Tobias, pulling out his phone and tossing it to the boy. Silas moved to the woman, her hands working at the ropes. They were tight, professional. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. The woman was crying now, whole body shaking. "It's okay," Silas heard himself say. "You're safe. I've got you." The tape came off her mouth carefully. She gasped, sobbing. "They're coming back. 10 o'clock. They said 10 o'clock. Silas checked his watch. 9:53 p.m. Behind him, Tobias was speaking quickly to a 911 operator, giving the address, explaining what they'd found. The boy's voice was steady, clearer than Silas had heard it. He sounded older than 9. He sounded like someone who'd had to grow up too fast. The ropes finally came loose. The woman collapsed forward, and Silas caught her. She weighed almost nothing. "How many?" he asked. "How many women have they brought here?" "I don't know." I was grabbed 3 days ago.
From the subway. I'm a student at NYU. They said I was going overseas, that I'd never see home again. Footsteps in the stairwell. Heavy. Multiple people. Silas's blood turned to ice. Tobias, he said quietly. Take her. There's a fire exit at the end of the hall. Get outside and wait for the police. What about you? I'll handle this. Mr. Ravencroft? Go, now! Tobias grabbed the woman's hand and ran. Silas heard them disappear down the hall as the footsteps grew closer. His mind raced. He had no weapon, no training. He was a 52-year-old man who spent his days in boardrooms. But this was his building, his name on the deed, his responsibility. The door swung open. 2 men entered, one tall and thin, one built like a linebacker. They stopped when they saw Silas standing there, the empty chair behind him. "Oh, who the hell are you?" the tall one demanded. Silas straightened, found his voice, the one he used in hostile takeovers, the one that had closed $100 million deals. "I'm Silas Ravencroft. I own this building, and you're done." The linebacker laughed. "You got no idea what you just walked into, old man." "I know exactly what I walked into. Human trafficking, operating out of my property. The police are already on their way. I suggest you run while you still can." The tall one pulled something from his jacket. A knife. But that's when the sirens started. Distant at first, then closer. The 2 men's faces changed. The linebacker turned and bolted. The tall one hesitated, looking between Silas and the door. "Your choice," Silas said, his voice not shaking despite the terror coursing through him. "But I'm not moving." The man ran.
Silas's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the floor, breathing like he'd just climbed a mountain. Through the window, he could see flashing blue and red lights filling the street below. The truth beneath the surface. The next 3 hours were chaos. Police flooded Building 7. Detectives questioned Silas, Tobias, and the rescued woman, whose name was Kendra Alvarez, a 23-year-old biology student. Tobias's cardboard documentation became evidence. His drawings led to the arrest of 7 men connected to a trafficking ring that had been operating across 4 states. Silas learned that the men had been using his building for 6 months. They'd bribed a maintenance supervisor to give them access to 4D, which had been listed as under renovation in the system. No one had checked. No one had cared enough to verify. His building, his negligence. At 1:30 a.m., a detective approached Silas in the lobby where he'd been waiting. "Mr. Ravencroft, the boy, Tobias, he's asking for you." Silas found Tobias wrapped in a blanket, sitting on a bench with a female officer. He looked smaller than ever, exhausted beyond measure. "They said I need to go to a shelter," Tobias said when Silas sat down. "For processing." "No." The word came out before Silas could think. "He'll stay with me. I'll take full responsibility. I'll get a lawyer if necessary. But he's not going to a shelter." The officer frowned. "Sir, there are procedures." "Then start them." "But he's coming home with me tonight." Tobias stared at him with those 2 old eyes. Why? It was the question Silas had been avoiding. Why had he listened? Why had he gotten in the car? But why had he believed a homeless child over his own instincts to protect himself? "Because you saved her life," Silas said finally. "And maybe mine too." The drawing that changed everything. 3 months later, Tobias sat in the living room of Silas's penthouse, working on a new drawing at the massive oak table that overlooked Central Park. He had his own room now, his own clothes. A tutor came 5 days a week to help him catch up on the education he'd missed. Silas had hired a trauma therapist, a child psychologist, a social worker to navigate the legal process of becoming Tobias's legal guardian. The Ferrari had been repaired, but Silas never drove it. He'd had the hood panel removed and preserved. Kendra's terrified face, drawn in a desperate boy's blood, now hung in a frame in his office. A reminder. Building 7 had been thoroughly investigated. The maintenance supervisor was fired and arrested. Silas implemented new security protocols across all his properties, mandatory inspections, employee background checks, anonymous reporting systems for suspicious activity. He donated $10 million to organizations fighting human trafficking. He gave Kendra a full scholarship and hired her as a consultant on safety measures. But the biggest change wasn't in his buildings or his bank accounts. Tobias had asked him last week why he'd finally listened. Why that night, that moment, that drawing had broken through 30 years of carefully constructed walls. Silas had thought about it for a long time before answering. "Because you reminded me that I'm not just what I own," he'd said. "I'm what I do when no one's watching, when there's no profit to be made, when helping someone costs me everything and gains me nothing." "Did it cost you everything?" Tobias had asked. Silas had looked around his penthouse, still pristine, still perfect, still empty, except for them. "No," he'd admitted. "It gave me everything." The trafficking ring's complete dismantling had made national news. 17 additional victims were rescued across 4 states. Tobias's drawings had been crucial in identifying perpetrators. Law enforcement called him a hero. But Tobias never wanted to talk about it. He just wanted to draw. "What are you working on?" Silas asked now, walking over to the table with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, a routine they'd developed. Tobias turned the sketch pad around. It showed Silas himself standing in that empty apartment, looking at the chair. But in the drawing, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood the shadow of a younger man, broken, angry, scared. And in front of him stood an older man, eyes open, finally seeing. "It's you," Tobias said, "before and after." Silas's throat tightened. "You think people can change?" "I think you did." They sat in silence for a while, drinking chocolate, watching the city lights blink below them. 2 years after that night, Silas Ravencroft stood before a crowd of 300 people at the grand opening of the Tobias House, a comprehensive support center for homeless youth in Manhattan. It offered shelter, education, job training, legal services, and an art studio where kids could learn to express themselves. Tobias, now 13, had helped design every aspect of it. He'd insisted on a wall where young people could create murals, drawings, anything they needed to say. The wall was already covered in art, faces and stories and dreams. "I used to think invisibility was the worst thing that could happen to a person," Silas told the crowd. "Being so overlooked that you cease to exist in people's minds. I spent 30 years making myself impossible to ignore, building wealth, power, reputation. But I was wrong." He paused, looking at Tobias, who stood at the side of the stage, uncomfortable with attention as always. "The worst thing isn't being invisible, it's losing the ability to see. I was blind to everything that didn't increase my net worth, blind to suffering, blind to humanity, blind to the fact that the most important things we do are the ones that can't be measured in profit margins." His voice grew stronger. "A boy drew on my car, vandalized my most prized possession. And in doing so he made me see again. He reminded me that every person has value, every life matters, every voice deserves to be heard." The applause was deafening, but Silas barely heard it. He was watching Tobias, who smiled slightly, a rare expression, and nodded once. After the ceremony, they walked back to the car together. The Ferrari had been sold months ago. Silas drove a hybrid now, more practical, Tobias had said, Less, look at me, more, let's just get there. Do you regret it? Tobias asked as they drove home. Giving up the person you were? Silas thought about his ex-wives, his former business partners, the people who'd called him ruthless and cold. He thought about the sister he'd failed, the years he'd wasted accumulating things instead of connections. I didn't give him up, Silas said finally. Lost him a long time ago. You helped me find who I was supposed to be. Who's that? Someone who uses what he has to see what others miss. Someone who listens when a child draws a picture in blood because he has no other way to be heard. Someone who finally understands that wealth isn't what you hoard, it's what you give away. They pulled into the underground garage of the penthouse building. As they walked to the elevator, Tobias said quietly, "She wrote to me again, Kendra. She's graduating next month. Top of her class. Will you go to the ceremony?" "If you come with me." Silas wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders. "Wouldn't miss it." In the elevator, Tobias pulled out his ever-present sketch pad and showed Silas a new drawing. It depicted a massive tree with deep roots and sprawling branches. Faces filled the branches, Kendra, the other rescued women, kids at Tobias' house, and at the center, Silas and Tobias together. "What's this one called?" Silas asked. "The forest that grew from a single seed," Tobias said. "That's what you told me once. That one act of courage or kindness can grow into something massive. That night, in that building, that was the seed." Silas studied the drawing, the intricate details, the way Tobias captured not just faces, but souls. This child who'd lost everything, who'd been invisible to society, had somehow become the most visible thing in Silas's life. "Frame this one too," Silas said. "Where will you put it?" "Right next to the first one, so I never forget." "Forget what?" Silas looked at the boy who'd vandalized his car and saved his life. That the most valuable things we own are the ones we can't buy. That sometimes destruction is the first step toward creation. And that seeing, truly seeing the people everyone else ignores, is the only wealth that actually matters. The elevator doors opened to the penthouse. Inside, the table was set for dinner, a routine they'd developed. Tuesday was pasta night, Tobias's choice. As they ate, Tobias talked about a new student at Tobias' house, a 15-year-old girl who'd been living in subway tunnels and had an incredible singing voice. Silas listened, asked questions, made mental notes about resources they could provide. This was his life now, not board meetings and hostile takeovers, not isolated luxury and calculated relationships. But this, a shared meal, a son he'd never expected, but a purpose that filled the spaces wealth had never touched. That night, after Tobias had gone to bed, Silas stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Somewhere out there, people were invisible, overlooked, crying for help in ways that most would never hear. But he heard them now, he finally heard them. The legacy of seeing. 5 years after the drawing on the Ferrari, Silas Ravencroft stood in a courtroom for the final hearing. Tobias was 16 now, taller, more confident, but still carrying that sketchpad everywhere, still drawing faces, capturing stories, making the invisible scene. "Mr. Ravencroft," the judge said, "the court has reviewed your petition for formal adoption. Given the success of the guardianship arrangement and Tobias's clear well-being, I'm prepared to grant the request. However, but I want to ask Tobias directly, do you want Silas Ravencroft to legally become your father?" Tobias stood. For a moment he was that small 9-year-old again, terrified and alone. Then he looked at Silas, and his voice came out clear and strong. He already is, Tobias said. He's been my dad since the night he chose to see me when everyone else looked away. Since he believed me when believing meant risking everything. Since he let me ruin his car to save someone's life. The judge smiled. Then by the power vested in me by the state of New York, I hereby grant this adoption. Congratulations. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. They always did now. Silas Ravencroft's transformation from ruthless billionaire to child advocate had become legendary. But Silas had learned to use the attention wisely. And every interview was a chance to talk about Tobias' house, about the 73 youth shelters he'd funded across the country, about policy changes needed to protect vulnerable children. "Mr. Ravencroft," a reporter called, "how does it feel?" Silas looked at Tobias, at his son, and felt something he'd never experienced in 5 decades of chasing wealth: completeness. "It feels like I finally understand what fortune means," Silas said. "I spent my whole life building an empire, convinced that success meant having more than everyone else. But real fortune isn't what you accumulate. It's who you become when you stop counting possessions and start counting people who matter." "And the Ferrari?" another reporter asked. "Any regrets about the car?" Silas laughed. Something he did easily now. That car cost $4.3 million. The drawing on it cost a boy his blood, and possibly his life. But it saved a woman from trafficking, dismantled a criminal organization, and taught me that sometimes the most expensive thing you own is exactly what you need to sacrifice. He put his hand on Tobias's shoulder. "Best investment I ever made was the one I didn't plan, the one that chose me." They walked to the car, the practical hybrid, and drove to Tobias' house for the weekly art show, where kids displayed their work and told their stories. It was Tobias's favorite event. In the studio, a new student approached them nervously. She was maybe 12, with haunted eyes Silas recognized. She held out a piece of paper, a drawing of a bird breaking free from a cage. "Mr. Tobias told me to draw my story," she whispered. "This is mine." Tobias knelt down to her level. "It's beautiful."
What's the bird's name?" "Hope." Silas felt his chest tighten. This moment, this quiet, unmarketable, uncelebratable moment, was worth more than every dollar in his accounts. This was legacy. Not buildings with his name engraved in marble. Not wealth that would be divided among strangers. But this. Children finding their voices, their hope, their futures. "Would you like to hear a story?" Tobias asked the girl. "About how I met my dad." She nodded eagerly. As Tobias began to speak about a desperate night, a white Ferrari, a drawing in blood, Silas stepped back and watched. Other kids gathered around, listening. Some knew the story. Some heard it for the first time. But all of them leaned in, recognizing themselves in the narrative. This was the ripple effect. One act of courage. One moment of choosing to see instead of looking away.
One decision to value life over luxury. The seed had become a forest. Later, driving home through Manhattan traffic, Tobias said, "I've been thinking about college." "Oh? Art school? Maybe NYU. Kendra says the program is amazing." Silas smiled. "You can go anywhere you want, do anything you want." "I want to teach kids like me, like I was. I want to show them that art isn't just drawing. It's voice, it's power, it's survival." "You already do that." "I want to do it bigger, like you did with Tobias' house. I want to build something that outlasts me." They pulled into the garage. As they walked to the elevator, Silas said, "You know what I've learned, Tobias? Legacy isn't about buildings or money. It's about moments. It's about the night a homeless boy vandalized a car to save a stranger's life. It's about a billionaire who finally understood that wealth means nothing if you're too blind to see suffering. "Do you think you were always capable of changing?" Tobias asked. "Or did I just catch you at the right moment?" Silas thought about his sister, about the decades of selfishness, about the man he'd been, isolated, paranoid, convinced that sentiment was weakness. "I think," he said slowly, "that we're all capable of change. But change requires someone brave enough to break through our walls. You didn't just draw on my car, Tobias. You drew on my heart. You vandalized my entire world view." "Good." They laughed together, the easy laughter of family, and rode the elevator up to the penthouse that had once been a prison of luxury and was now simply home. On the table, Tobias had left his latest drawing, a boy and a man standing side by side, looking at a cityscape filled with lights. Each light was a face, hundreds of faces, thousands maybe, all the people they'd helped or would help, all the invisible made visible. Beneath it, Tobias had written, "To the man who taught me that seeing is the greatest superpower. Thanks for looking down when everyone else looked away. Love, your son." Silas hung the drawing in the hallway, next to the original Ferrari hood panel with Kendra's face, next to the forest that grew from a single seed, next to dozens of others, an entire gallery of moments when choosing to see changed everything. He stood there for a long time, looking at the collection. A visual history of transformation, of a boy who drew to survive and a man who learned to live. Outside the windows, the city sprawled endlessly. Millions of people, millions of stories, and somewhere out there, someone was being overlooked, ignored, dismissed as invisible. But not by Silas Ravencroft, not anymore. He'd learned the most important lesson a billionaire could learn. The greatest fortune isn't what you own, it's who you see. And thanks to a desperate drawing on a white Ferrari hood, Silas Ravencroft finally saw everything.